If you're planning on completing a campaign in Warhammer 3, chances are you're going to come up against legendary lords from all kinds of factions. Once you take down these legendary lords, you'd expect a suitably legendary reward, but that isn't always the case. Sometimes when you beat a lord, you're rewarded with a trait so weak or pointless that you wonder why you even bothered in the first place. So today, let's count down the top 10 worst defeat traits in Total War Warhammer 3, right after I tell you all about holy energy faster than these Ironsides can take down some skeletons. And here we go. Holy energy is the cleanest way to stay energized, whether you're beating your personal best on the scoreboards or in the gym. All of their flavors are free from sugar, taurine, and all of that other BS filler that traditional energy drinks are rammed full of. Plus, this is slow, stable energy instead of that big hit of anxiety all at once. So instead of rocking back and forth waiting for your heart to stop finding its way out of your chest, you can take a delicious, relaxed sip and get a nice tailwind for the next few hours. Speaking as someone who is prone to panic attacks, both caffeine and otherwise, this stuff really does work and hits substantially gentler than alternatives while still giving me the kick I need. Alongside this, Holy Energy also comes in a range of flavours, and if you ask me, one of the best is Citrus Camel. I don't really know what prickly pear is, but I do know that it tastes sweet, fruity, and hits the spot just right. But if that doesn't sound up your street, click the link in the description and take a look at the rest to choose for yourself. And while you're there, if you decide to pick up anything, be sure to use code Colonel5 at checkout for £5 off your first order, or just code Colonel for 10% off anything store-wide, no matter how many times you keep coming back for more. You can grab some tasty energy for a great price, and I get a small kickback to keep the lights on, so everybody wins. One last thank you to Holy for partnering with the channel, and now let's see how those Ironsides are getting on. Yet another flawless victory. So kicking off the list, we have Emer, the Dragon Dude. Now, these buffs have one thing about them that's good, and that's that they are always active. As you're going to see on this list, a lot of traits need some pretty specific circumstances to even come online, so the fact we get these no matter what is kind of a win in my book. Unfortunately, the price for this win is pretty weak sauce. So, 8 bonus versus large damage. Even if all of that is armor piercing, which it won't be, 8 extra damage per swing just on your lord when fighting something large, and this is all assuming that your lord is a melee fighter. Notice how it's a whole lot of specifics to get 8 extra damage when most units have thousands of HP. 8 HP isn't going to make that much difference, and that's not even accounting for the fact that any of it gets blocked by armor. As for the fire resistance, I mean, if you're going against the Chaos Dwarves, then this will be kinda nice, but aside from that, it's a little bit niche. Fire is a relatively rare damage type, and even then it's not all that great unless you're specifically weak to fire, so you're blocking 25% of a damage effect that doesn't do all that much damage. It's nice that the effects are always there, but man, those effects could stand to be a little more worth the effort. Moving over to Bellar Ironhammer from the Dwarves, and his trait focused on improving your lord's stats in subterranean intercept battles. Now, 4 leadership and 10 melee attack is actually pretty good if you get it on the right lord. That said, if you get this on a caster or a ranged lord or anything that isn't a melee fighter, you're getting basically no value. Then, beyond that, how often do you actually fight subterranean intercept battles in the first place? Not just general subterranean, you have to intercept or be the one doing the intercepting. I played around 200 turns across all of the DLC campaigns, multiple of them going against or alongside the dwarves or other factions that can use the underways, and I didn't fight a single one of these battles manually or use an auto-resolve. Even when fighting against other dwarves and greenskins and all the others that can use underways and subterranean methods of travel, these battles aren't all that common, so you're hardly ever going to be able to even use these extremely mediocre buffs to just your lord. If there was something else tossed in there for the army too, it wouldn't be so bad, but 99% of the time you're going to get exactly nothing from this trait, so it's going on the list. And you can put me in the book all you want, but I know I'm right. Next up we have High Queen Cleer, moving over to the desert for a little bit. The missile unit recruitment rank, honestly, that ain't that bad. Almost any faction in the game will enjoy some value from that, even if in the late game, units will max out their rank almost instantly if you're playing right anyway, but I digress. Still, it's nice to get a head start. The other part, however, is a total dookie. Bonus relations with the vampire counts is useful for exactly 2 factions. Other vampire counts, like the nearby Manfred, and Aran the Black. For pretty much everyone else, they're still not going to manage to be friends, with most aversion penalties cancelling this out completely. Maybe, if you're a fellow evil faction and join a couple of their wars, you might get to at least agree not to attack each other in the next one turn, but we all know how most of these promises eventually go down. Making allies with evil factions is a waste of time in the first place, so a trait that buffs the ability to do that is pretty pointless for almost everyone. Staying in the desert, next up we have Aran the Black. This runs in the same vein as Cleer, but combines that with an even more useless secondary buff. So we have extra relations with Tomb Kings, and while they aren't evil, they mostly like to keep to themselves, so getting a proper alliance on the go will be a little bit of a challenge unless you happen to be another Tomb King, and even then, no guarantees. Then we have the bonus weapon strength when fighting against the vampire counts. just for your lord. Just like I said for Bellar, 25% weapon strength, that's no joke if you get on an already strong frontlines fighter. However, not every lord in the game is a frontlines melee fighter, so some of that time that buff will be useless, and beyond that, it's only when fighting against the vampire counts, and they aren't exactly the most common faction on the map. They're a little bit more spread out than they used to be, but still, most of the time they're limited to very small concentrated areas of the map, and most importantly, are nowhere near Arcan. As much as I love Manny, he's always getting wiped out, so the closest faction to Arcan you can reliably use this on is probably Vlad, all the way up in the north, unless by some miracle one of the minor vampire factions in the south has survived past the first few turns. Occasionally, you can make use of the relations and become trade buddies with some of the other Tomb Kings, but unless you're specifically hunting down the other vampires, you'll hardly ever get use out of that buff, even if you are using a lord that will benefit from it. Now let's move over to Kislev to see Rasputin himself, Gestalten. On paper, this one don't seem that bad. Flaming attacks are kind of whatever, but plus 6 leadership for the whole army, that's pretty strong. But when you really get down to it, how often are you actually battling in your own lands, especially if you get this on your legendary lord? I feel like if you're doing well in game, 90% of fighting gets done in enemy territory, so 90% of the time, your army will see exactly nothing from this buff, meaning all you're getting is flaming attacks on your lord, which, again, is only useful if they're a melee fighter, and even then, flaming is one of the weakest effects you can have in the entire game. I get why he has this trait, since it's basically what he does, light things on fire with his staff and defend his land. But most campaigns in Warhammer 3 are based on conquering, not defending, so unless you're getting hit hard in the late game Mega War, you likely won't see the majority of the buff from this trait. It's a bit of a shame since 6 leadership can push units enough to make somewhat of a difference, but locking it behind being in your own territory just makes it useful when things are dire instead of helping when they're going well. Crossing the halfway point, we have a nice simple one from Grombrindle. The lord who wins this trait now causes terror when fighting against dwarves. I've said it enough times, but this is only useful on a frontlines lord, and even then, terror is one of those effects I find to be essentially useless aside from in very specific situations. If you really need to make a break in the enemy line, then terror can be good, but if you also have the option to flank, or shoot them, or break through in seconds anyway using monsters or something else big, it doesn't really serve a purpose. Add on to this, it's only useful when fighting dwarves, and it's feeling extremely niche. Dwarves are relatively scattered across the map, but they're hardly everywhere, especially nearby to where you find Grombrindle. When he was in the old world, this would have probably made a lot more sense and got a lot more value, but these days with him way out in the frozen mountains, it's essentially pointless. Once you pick this up, even if you made a beeline for the closest other dwarf faction, you'd be forced matching for a good 10 to 15 turns at least, and that's assuming minor factions have survived. Now he has his new starting location, I think a new trait should be in order because as it stands, this one makes no sense and gets no use. Staying in that same vein of terror and going back to Kislev, we have Catharsis. I know what you're thinking, this is the same but better since it also has Frostbite. Well, let me explain. Frostbite is alright, it's better than Flaming, but as usual, it's only useful if your lord is a melee fighter. It's no poison, but slow on targets, it isn't half bad. However, the terror when fighting Kislev is far, far worse than the terror when fighting dwarves, since Kislev is found in exactly one place on the entire map. I mean, fair enough, once you beat Catharsis, you can use this to take down the rest of Kislev, but if you've beaten her, chances are you've probably beaten all of them since she tends to be the last stand in almost every campaign. So you get a mid effect and then get to cause some terror when fighting against pretty much no one. At best, you can use this against some stragglers who have 1 army and 6 units to their faction's name, but aside from that, you're never really going to get value out of this again. It's not just there's not a lot of chance that you'll run into Kislev, it's more of a guarantee that you won't. Let's go back to the undead for a little bit with Count Noctus. We've talked about some conditional traits, and this one might just be the king of them all. So, if you fight against the Vampire Coast, who appear in all of like 3 areas of the map and rarely expand much beyond that, you gain an extra 5 leadership for your entire army, which is, it's fine. It's not great, but it's not awful. Then, if you're also fighting at sea like you are basically never, you gain another 5 leadership. However, if you're fighting on land against factions other than the Vampire Coast, you get precisely jack shit. I think the only times I actually fight at sea are when I'm trying to get across the map and someone decides to pull up on me while I'm sailing, or when an enemy army keeps fleeing and I chase them into the water. Outside of that, I never choose to fight on the sea since there's not really any point. For as much as people ask for naval battles, would anyone ever use them since there's not really much on the water worth fighting over? Funnily enough, the only time when you get proper value out of this trait is against Noctus himself. To get to him, your only option is to cross the open sea and to fight the Vampire Coast. Outside of that, the chances of using even one of these leadership buffs is pretty much next to 0. Moving over to the land of the Wood Elves with Durthu, yet another trait that has an insanely specific requirement, and this time the bonus you unlock, it's even worse. So, to even feel any benefit from this trait, you need to be fighting against the Wood Elves. This is a faction that basically always keeps to itself in very specific and heavily fortified areas of the map. Outside of Dryker, your chances of running into these guys outside of a magical forest is pretty close to zero. So, when we do eventually get to fight them, what's our special reward to give us an edge? Flaming attacks for just your lord. Look, I get that Durfu is a tree and probably has a bit of pyrophobia, but really, flaming attacks for just the lord. So they need to be a frontlines fighter and bring their own damage to the table, but now it has a little bit of spice on it. And yeah, I know that tree spirits are weak to fire, so technically this is a decent damage buff versus them, but there's also like 80% of the Wood Elf roster that isn't weak to fire. So you have to fight against a faction that you can only find in less than 10% of the map, and then you need to focus on fighting 20% of that faction's roster with a lord that, again, is good in melee, so all you can get is a bit of bonus damage. When you do use it, I mean, sure, it'll be fine, but getting the opportunity to use it is just so painfully unlikely, it makes my head hurt. And in first place, for the worst trait in Warhammer 3, we're sticking with the Wood Elves, it's Orion. Man, if you thought Bellar had a niche battle type to buff, you haven't seen anything yet. So, if you beat Orion, your lord will gain some leadership and attack every time they're involved in a forest battle. These can happen in the magical forest dotted around the map, and the majority of which are right next to Orion. So, if you beat him, you'll get to use that trait maybe 4 times before it becomes useless forever. Add on the fact that magical forest elements are useless to almost every non-Wood Elf faction to the mix, and the chances of this trait coming in useful drastically go down. And of course, this is all assuming you have a fighter who would benefit from the extra leadership and attack. I mean, Orion is a hybrid weapons dude. Shouldn't we get some missile buffs in there, you know, just for a bit of variety? So, we have very weak buffs that only activate when you fight in insanely specific locations on the map. We're not even in the realm of fighting factions anymore. We have to be in specific locations, and those locations are undesirable to attack for basically everyone in the game other than other Wood Elves themselves. If you are playing as Dryker, then maybe this is useful. But aside from that, this straight up sucks and is basically useless. And that's my list. Let me know in the comments if you'd make any changes. Don't forget to check out Holy and use my codes to save some money at the link in the description. Like, subscribe, and if you want to see more Warhammer 3 top 10s, then how about this video, counting down the top 10 best defeat traits.